Can it even be the case that we can still be somehow surprised today with regard to the hope we are given in the Bible? Hasn't everything already been understood, written, and said about it? Does anyone here think they know better than the first Christians, the church fathers, the great theological thinkers of the Middle Ages and the Reformation? We may have already noticed from the list in the last question that the focus here was strongly on the so-called Western Church, the Roman Church. For example, the Eastern Church, for example, which means the Greek Orthodox Church and the churches of the Middle East, are missing from the list, or the further development of Judaism. And all of their hopes are sometimes far apart. But can we today know any more about the Old Testament or the New Testament and the context in which they were written than even the church fathers? The answer here must be a resounding yes. And why is this the case? Because today we have many more sources from antiquity at our disposal and the languages used are better understood. What did the church fathers know, for example? They had very few sources at their disposal. Many were part of a local persecuted group and not scholars with access to huge libraries and computers. And they were not even closer to the languages used than we are today. Excuse me? How many of the church fathers do you think could read the Old Testament in Hebrew, for example? Not even a handful. And why do you think that Jerome was commissioned to produce a Latin translation of the Bible, later called the Vulgate, at the end of the 4th century? Not only because of the differences in the existing Latin translation. The fact that they were Latin translations show that most of them did not even know Greek. And Jerome also translated the Old Testament from the Septuagint, i.e. the Greek translation, and his knowledge of Hebrew is unclear. See also my series here, The Canon of the New Testament. From the 2nd century onwards, people had already moved far away from Paul's letters and the texts of the 1st century in their thinking and reasoning. And the Old Testament was pushed aside as outdated. See, for example, for more details, the video The Canon of the New Testament, Part 13, Marcion and Other Vanished Christians. We should also not overlook the strong influence of Greek philosophy, especially Plato, on Christian doctrine and theology, and even Judaism at the time of Christ. When were the doctrines of heaven and hell, purgatory, and the immortal soul coined in their present form? Do we find them in the text of the Old or New Testament, with the church fathers, or only from the Middle Ages onwards? We shall see. It is therefore a question of going back to the text of the Old and New Testament with all possibilities available to us today. What can a biblical scholar say today about what the Apostle Paul wrote, for example? Or what can be found in the Gospels? What was the message the Christians heard and proclaimed in the 1st century? That's what this video series will be about. Fortunately, this book, Surprised by Hope, Rethinking Heaven, the Resurrection, and the Mission of the Church by Bible scholar Wright, is available in English and, for the German version of this video, also in German, where it has the title Von Hoffnung überrascht, was die Bibel zur Auferstehung und ewigem Leben sagt. Therefore, in this series, I would like to present only the main points and encourage everyone to read the book for themselves and check the arguments against the Bible. One important note: I read the book in the German translation. So the quotes are from the German translation and retranslated into English. The quotes will therefore differ from the English original. But I hope you understand that I didn't buy also the English version and then do a comparison. So I encourage you to read the English one, and then you will find the original wording used by N.T. Wright. So, firstly, I would like to briefly provide some information about N.T. Wright. Not because an argument becomes more important or more correct, or more right, because a recognized scholar says so. In Wikipedia, I found this about him. Nicholas Thomas Wright, better known as N.T. Wright or Tom Wright, was professor of New Testament and early Christianity at the University of St. Andrews, Anglican bishop emeritus of Durham in England, and one of the leading New Testament theologians and Life of Jesus scholars in the English-speaking world. He has been a senior research fellow at the University of Oxford since 2019. Wright is an independent, unconventional thinker who challenges modern and classical interpretations and is difficult to categorize. He sets out complex theological issues in a clear and readable way to make the reader think. So, I think he's a quite good choice for our topic. So let's listen to what someone has to say who has devoted decades of academic research to the text of the New Testament and the Pauline letters in particular. So let's start with an important note in the foreword. All language about the future, as an economist or politician will tell you, is nothing more than a series of signposting into the fogs. Signs pointing into the fog. We are looking through a glass darkly, said St. Paul as he looked at what is to come. All our language about future states of the world and of ourselves consist of complex images that correspond more or less well with the ultimate reality. But that doesn't mean that things are completely unclear or that every opinion about these things is equally valid. And what if someone came out of the fog to meet us? This is, of course, the central, if often ignored, Christian belief. In this respect, no one should claim to know exactly what the hope and future of a Christian will look like. After all, Paul said that he and his contemporaries could not do this, even though they had the Holy Spirit. See 1 Corinthians 13, verse 12. So this brings us to the point where you should briefly consider what hope you have. As a Catholic, you probably believe that you will go to heaven after death, but not to hell for eternity, and only briefly in purgatory. Interestingly, heaven and hell were adopted in the Quran and thus the Islam, although this is not found in either the Old or New Testament in the same way. As a Protestant, you probably also hope to go to heaven, but the hell thing? Too cruel. Maybe everyone will go to heaven one day? For some, that sounds a lot like Asian religions and philosophies, to be reunited with God or the universe. I would particularly like to address the hope of Jehovah's Witnesses and ex-witnesses, not only because of my own experiences with that religion, because it has often taken an interesting turn. That's the most interesting part. When Jehovah's Witnesses were still called Bible students or international Bible students, they also essentially believed that they would go to heaven like all Christians. When the hope proclaimed for years that millions now living will never die, and this was not fulfilled in 1925, the move to heaven simply had to be postponed. In the 1930s, the president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, J.F. Rutherford, not only gave his followers a new name, Jehovah's Witnesses, but also a new hope. Only a small remnant of the literal 144,000 anointed Christians would go to heaven to reign with Jesus. All the others would be called other sheep and would remain on the earth. However, many now woken up and realized that J.F. Rutherford only justified this doctrine of the other sheep at the time on the basis of his own made type and antitype comparisons. That is why these original articles from the 1930s have not been quoted in Watchtower literature for a long time, for decades. Then everyone would notice that it's not a biblical, proven hope, but some own-made type and antitype comparisons were used, which Jehovah's Witnesses now say if it's not in the Bible, you shouldn't accept them. But this leads now for ex-Jehovah's Witnesses to an interesting problem. If there are no two hopes, as Jehovah's Witnesses still teach, but only one hope for all followers of Jesus, then it is the heavenly hope, isn't it? So the children of God all go to heaven. Welcome to the bosom of church, I would like to say. But not quite. What about the others? Do they go to purgatory and hell? Well, anyone who has preached for years and decades that the Bible shows that there is no hell and no immortal soul will probably not believe that. But what then? Will such people be destroyed forever as the final judgment? Doesn't that still sound like something out of the Jehovah's Witnesses preaching toolbox? And what about what happens between death as a human being and the future? Are we then in the memory of God? Sounds somewhat familiar too, right? I wonder how many proof texts have already gone through your head for one thing or another. But we still draw our conclusions far too early, because we unconsciously still have a lot of ideas as presuppositions in our thinking. And because reading the Bible is usually not enough, not even with prayer and the Holy Spirit. He would have to perform true miracles because we can neither read the text in the original languages nor with the context of their time. We do not understand the meaning of the words and phrases. Often we even miss the almost obvious references to the Old Testament when references made to the Septuagint or linguistic images are used, or the use of certain words and terms in the first century. What was perhaps clear to every follower of Christ at the time is not self-explanatory for us. And even worse, we read terms in the translations and associate them with ideas that the disciples of Jesus in the first century did not even have. So the motto can only be now back to the text and back to the context. And that's exactly where we start in the next part, using Andy Wright's book. I will publish several parts of this series, probably 8. Perhaps there will be other videos published in between, but I try to do that every week. I hope to see you then soon for this or the next video of this series or other video series. And then I say goodbye.